some of the most distinguished print journalists in Chicago, and a woman who is also one of the foremost media entrepreneurs in the entire country. So before any other delay, why don't we introduce our panelists briefly, because we want to get to the heart of the discussion. Our time is going to be shortened a little bit because the introductory session went a little longer than we thought, okay? So let's introduce our panelists. To my immediate left is Don Wycliff. Don is the public editor of the Chicago Tribune. He has spent an entire career in journalism, graduate of the University of Notre Dame, was a reporter in Ohio, Illinois, and Washington before becoming a region section editor and assistant to the editor at the New York Times. He was a member of the New York Times editorial page from 1985 to 1990. And what that means is that Don was a member of the team that established the editorial position of the newspaper. You know what newspaper editorials are? You do? What are they?
All right.
Exactly. It is the official opinion of the editors of that newspaper. That newspaper's opinion, okay? Someone has to research those opinions, formulate them, write them, and they are very powerful. Come on in and take a seat. They're very powerful in influencing public opinion. Don did that for the New York Times, and then in 1990 he joined the Chicago Tribune. Under his leadership, the editorial page there has won numerous awards, including a Pulitzer Prize and 2 distinguished writing awards from the American Society of Newspaper Editors. Don is as I said, a Chicago resident. Actually, he lives in Evanston, and he is very active in the community there, and we welcome him this morning. To Don's immediate left is Salim Muwakkil, who is one of the most influential opinion columnists and commentators in Chicago and in the nation. Salim is a native of New York City. He was born there, graduated from Rutgers University, started his news career even before graduating, working for the Associated Press Bureau in Newark. The following year, he became a copy editor at Mohammed Speaks Balalian News, the largest black-owned publication in the country. During his time there, he also became managing editor of that newspaper, and in 1975 officially changed his name to Salim Muwakkil. By 1980, he was living in Chicago, serving as a writer and editor for the U.S. Department on Housing and Urban Development. He's also served as a freelance writer and contributing to various publications such as the New York Times and the Washington Post and Chicago Magazine. In 1984, he became the senior editor of a very influential publication called In These Times. And he has also served as a contributing columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times and is a contributing columnist today for the Chicago Tribune. He's also a frequent guest on news discussion shows. You may have seen him on Chicago Tonight and on the public affairs radio program Beyond the Beltway. Salim Muwakkil. Salim and Don and I also decided that we would like to be employees, work in the media. Cathy Hughes had a different vision. She decided she didn't want to work for the media, she wanted to own the medium. And she is the chairperson of the board and secretary at Radio 1. Radio 1 is a very large, very dynamic, black-owned group of urban radio stations throughout the country. She has been chairperson of Radio 1 since 1980 and chief executive officer from 1980 to 87. And she was one of the founders of the predecessor company of Radio 1 as well. She is also involved in a very exciting venture, which is to bring a different vision of cable network television program for African Americans, something that goes beyond endless rotations of music videos and that you see on some other networks. And that is the vision involved in TV One, which you can find on many cable systems right now. It's growing, black-owned cable television network, and she will talk a little bit about her vision for TV One and Radio One as well. Cathy Hughes. And at the very end of our table is Maureen Forte, who is a talk show personality and a motivational speaker. You have heard her perhaps on the air at WCFJ, and she is in touch with the very pulse of the city through the medium of radio and through talk shows and also through her consulting work. Maureen Forte. Before we begin, how many of you have ever thought about perhaps a career in journalism or in radio, TV, the internet, magazines, newspapers? A couple, two or three? Okay, all right. I think all of you will learn from the discussion today and benefit by it. Let's begin with some personal stories in terms of each of our panelists. What motivated you to want to be a part of the media? Was there a social event, something in your personal history? What was the motivation that drove you to try to get into this business? And let's go in reverse order. Let's start with Maureen.
Good morning. What's motivated me? Let me give you a very brief history about myself. I'm an educator with Chicago Public Schools. I'm an ESL teacher, which means I teach English as a second language. Yo hablo poquito español. I'm working on my Spanish, so I've got it down pat. I am the past president of Rainbow Push South Suburban Chapter. I'm Reverend Jackson's first female president. Under my leadership from 1990 to 2004, March 1st, I have 5,500 members under my leadership in the South Suburban area. I am the past vice president of the South Suburban chapter of the NAACP, which I have led the NAACP into a new direction. For 3.5 years, I worked very closely with Reverend Jesse L. Lewis Jackson as his producer of his talk show on WBEE 1570. One day, just out of the blue, when Reverend could not do the show, in turn, I ended up doing his program for him. And in fact, that one day, ended up doing several shows for Reverend Jackson as he traveled across the nation. And so then I received a phone call from WCFJ, asked if I would come in to do the news. So I said, okay, well, WCFJ is by O'Hara Airport, and I live in Homewood, Illinois. I told him it was not worth my time to come out there to do the news, but I can do my own show. He says, okay, well, airtime is very expensive. So I'm doing the show, I'm brokering my time, which I'm paying like $35 an hour. And with this, it turns out I go in and I cover stories that other people would not dare to do. I have been inside of Stateville Prison when I talked with the men on death row. One man I wanted to talk to, the guard, the warden in turn, put him inside of segregation because he was giving out too much information. Father's Day, I did a program on cries of fathers in prison. I asked the warden, please don't interrupt the phone call, and please do not put this guy in seg. I have it recorded on my, I have a recorded CD of this interview with Marvin Reeves, who's on death row, and he talked very openly and freely about how the guards, not the inmates, but the guards had beat him, had tortured him, had beaten with telephone books. So I go in and I interview people and bring issues to the table that other radio personalities will not do. I challenge the system. Meanwhile, after I left that radio station, as I was going to my car, a group of men had confronted me and asked me if I would do a shout out for their minister who was in prison. And I said, oh, well, how long have you been in prison? He said, 14 years. I said, well, what is the congregation doing? He said, no, he's not that kind of minister. He's a high-ranking gang leader minister, so you need to recognize. So this is what happens. The radio show is not as glamorous as people think because I'm putting information out there that other people don't want. I've had Brothers on the Download, Gerald King on. I've even went inside a women's correctional center where a woman went in who was not pregnant, but she ended up becoming pregnant and having a baby while incarcerated. And so what they did with her, they shackled her, they handcuffed her, and they would not let her have any body movements as she delivered her baby. So these are stories that need to be told. At the present time, I'm working with the Coalition to End the Death Penalty, and they had just received a $100,000 grant from the Ford Foundation for their work on the death penalty and the Coalition to End. My purpose for going into the media is to educate and inform my listening audience. I only have 1.8 million listeners, but there are issues that are out there that we need to be aware of. Thank you.
Thanks,
Wow.
Maureen.
You have 1 million listeners.
1.8 million.
1,000,008. Wow, that's incredible. I wanted to go into the media because I wanted to have the opportunity to tell the great story of Africans living in America from an African American perspective. I was tired of other people misinterpreting who we were and what was important to us as a community. And I felt that the only way to do that was to own my own communications outlet. I was a troubled teenager. I was pregnant at 16, a mother by 17, and I did not like authority and don't care much for it now, to be very honest with you. And the best way to avoid it is to be the boss. And when you are the boss, sometimes you have to pay the cost. But the reality is you also have an incredibly gratifying experience when you know that you are in fact making a difference. Today, I was blown away by 14-year-old Taylor, and I have with me my senior VP of marketing as well as one of my executive producers from my television channel, TV1, which you can see on digital in Chicago. We will be on analog soon. Cable comes two ways, digital and analog. Analog is the basic service. Digital is when you gotta have the box so you can do on demand and play games and do other things. But all three of us have already pulled her card, and you probably will be seeing Taylor on TV1 in the not too distant future, because all three of us were that blown away. That's why I went into media, so that I could sit in an audience and see one of you all with exceptional talent and be able to say, let's do it.
And I neglected to mention, Radio 1 controls 27 radio stations.
No.
27? Excuse me.
71.
71 radio stations, excuse me. I'm reading from your biography, it's dated. 71 radio stations in major markets all around the United States. You're not in Chicago, correct?
We're not in Chicago. We're in 7 of the top 10 markets. The 3 top 10 markets that we aren't in, unfortunately, are New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. But we're everywhere else in the top 10 markets, and we are in 22 of the majority African American populated cities around the country. We have 13 million listeners a day, and we have a syndicated program, Russ Parr, who is on in 28 markets, and it will be announced in the next few days that we just bought Tom Joyner's company, which is Reach Media.
So it's on the move, right?
On the move.
Salim?
Yes, I'm blown away by that, by Cathy Hughes' accomplishments, because the fact that there were so few black owners of media properties is one of the reasons that I became interested in the media in the first place. Now, I was kind of groomed or came of age during the time of the black movement. And at that time, everybody wanted to be a writer. You know, we had Amiri Baraka, Hakeem Mahabuti, who's here in Chicago. Everybody was trying to write something, mostly poetry, which didn't pay much. Nothing, as a matter of fact. So if you wanted to be a writer, you had to take a vow of poverty, essentially. The only thing you could do, really, to earn a living writing was journalism. And so that became my venue. I started writing a lot for the school paper. I realized I had a very influential instructor who said, if you want to write, if you want to be a writer, write. Simple as that. Write. Get your name out there. Get your byline known by people. And so I began to do a lot of writing in the school newspaper. And then Associated Press came looking. This is the most powerful wire service in the world. It was based in Newark, New Jersey, the Bureau in Newark, New Jersey, which is a city at that time had a black population of about 65%, but they had never had a black reporter in Newark, New Jersey. And so they were really looking, first of all, because they had been embarrassed by a report in the Kerner, so-called Kerner Commission, that happened after from 64 to 69 in this country. I don't know if you realize this, but about 300 cities exploded in violence, and people were trying to figure out why were African Americans so angry with what was happening that they were actually destroying their own cities, and more importantly, making business bad for those of us who wanted to do business in the city. So they tried to find out what was wrong, and they formed a commission called the Kerner Commission, which concluded that we were headed in two directions as a society, going in two directions, one black and one white. And the major culprit in that, or one of the major culprits, was the media, which had until then never really featured African Americans' life as human beings. We had been basically objects for the use of white people throughout our history. And so the Kerner Commission embarrassed the media, and they began to make these aggressive attempts to grab black people, grab black reporters who were literate. Anybody who had a semblance of literacy, they would grab. Like in Chicago, they grabbed Warner Saunders, who worked in Boys Club. They grabbed the fireman,
Rush Ewing.
Who was a fireman. So they were. Joe Boyce, exactly. He was a police officer, Joe Boyce. He was the first reporter for the Tribune. And so they grabbed me out of college, out of my classes in Rutgers, and made me a newsman at the Associated Press. And so that was an extremely important and very influential part of my career. In fact, it was the best laboratory I could ever have to be a journalist. And it taught me a lot. It gave me an understanding of how journalism really controls so much of what goes on in this society, because the media are our eyes and ears. Just as your eyes and ears tell you where to go, how to situate yourself, how to navigate through your community, the media tells us essentially how to navigate through the world. And if it gives us erroneous information, our navigation will be off. So we need a very well-attuned media, and I began to realize that and became extremely dedicated, I think, in a certain way, to trying to present the African American view, because no one else was doing that, and these were the days before Cathy Hughes and her great accomplishments. And that is something that I think is the most important thing that you could learn from this, is you have to control the media that you are working in, because if not, you simply pay the piper.
I was 22 years old. I had just graduated from the University of Notre Dame, and it was September of 1969, and I came to Chicago, lived in a little apartment at 47th and Drexel, and was going to graduate school at the University of Chicago. I was going to get a PhD and teach political science. And on the morning of December 4th, 1969, I woke up, turned on my radio, and heard the news of a so-called shootout on the west side of Chicago between the Chicago police and the members of the Black Panther Party, in which 2 members of the Panther Party had been killed, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. And I did not know either of them. I had just seen Fred Hampton on TV a couple of times being interviewed, but I felt a closeness that I can't explain, and I couldn't get that out of my head. And so in the months that followed, I would get up every day, buy the newspapers, read every word about that story. I'd watch the TV, see everything they reported. And as the weeks and months went on, they started peeling back the layers of lies. And it turned out that there wasn't a shootout at all. There was a shoot-in. And Fred Hampton and Mark Clark had essentially been assassinated by the Chicago police. And one day I said to myself, wow, these people in the media, these people at the newspapers especially, but also in particular WBBM TV, I said, wow, these people are doing really useful stuff, telling the public the truth about this. That's a good way to spend your life. I had never thought of journalism before. And so I decided I wanted to do that. After 1 year of graduate school, I left. I went home to Houston, Texas. I was from a little town near Houston. And for some reason, I thought I could do it. And so I went and started knocking on doors at the TV stations in Houston. Nobody would hire me because I didn't have any experience. And then I went to the Houston Post, which was one of the two big newspapers there at the time. And they had all of one black reporter in their newsroom, a guy I love to this day named Bob Newberry because he helped me so much. And they said, well, he's got a college degree from a good school. Let's give him a writing test. They gave me a writing test and said, okay, well, we'll make you an intern. And they put me under a former city editor, a man named C.W. Skipper. And over a period of about 3 months, he taught me the basics of how to go out and get a story. And that's how I got started in this business. And there's one thing I recall, and that is that one principle, and that is that the future always favors the prepared. I got to that newspaper that day. They didn't know me from Adam. But thanks to my father, who used to kick my behind and make me study, and he had 9 kids, and he did the same to all of us. And when we didn't want to, and teachers and my parents putting their trust in those teachers and saying, if you need any kind of support, let us know. I was prepared, and I got the opportunity.
Certainly for Salim and for Don and for me, we're all basically of the same generation, close to being of the same age. The dynamic, is very much the same in that we are the direct benefits, the first generation really to benefit from the civil rights movement. If there had not been the civil rights movement, if there had not been the cities that were going up in flames, if white editors had not understood and realized that they could not cover that story well without having African Americans on their staffs, we might not be there today. And that's the truth, because before that time period, no matter how talented you were or how well prepared you were or how intelligent you were not going to get that opportunity, because the newsrooms and the media, it was like a vast fortress, and the only way to get in was almost if you knew someone who was in. Mm-hmm. And since as African Americans we did not have those family connections or those relatives who could get us in the door and show us the way, we had to kind of break down the door. Some people ask me at times, how I got my first job. My first job was at the Chicago Tribune. I was an intern there in 1974 and 75. And they say, how did you get your job? Well, who got you your job? I tell them Martin Luther King got me a job. I mean, I'm under no delusion. I was very well prepared. I had graduated from the journalism school at Northwestern. But I know that would not have meant anything. Because even if it had not been for that social revolution that was going on, so it's a matter of being prepared for an opportunity. And you don't know when that opportunity is going to come or how it's going to come. But the preparation, as Don mentioned, is key. Even when I first got to the Tribune, I remember walking into that vast newsroom in 1974. I was just finished my sophomore year in college. And that was before they kind of redesigned the newsroom to look like an insurance office. I mean, it looked like a newsroom, It was kind of, it was huge. But I remember seeing this sea of white men in white shirts. There were a few African American reporters there, but it was just this sea of white maledom. And it wasn't only the racial aspect, of course, we're emphasizing too, but there was also this whole gender aspect. The most amazing thing to me in that sense is when I first got to the Tribune, you walked into the newsroom, there was not a woman's room in the newsroom. There was a men's room in the newsroom, but the women's room was across the hall in what they called the Sunday room, where they did, where the feature stories were, the cooking section, the sections, and the food and fashions, women's stuff. So even that, now the newsroom was built in the 20s, and it really hadn't been substantially remodeled since then. But that tells you a lot about what you need to know in terms of what the situation was then and how it's developed since. We've had some good news. This is breaking news. Our time isn't going to be truncated. They're going to push the schedule back. So we're going to have about 55 minutes together. So we will be able to get to some of your questions, and we'll be able to have more time to get responses from our panelists. So we talked about the initial motivation for getting into the business. Talk to me now a bit about how the business has changed, and how those changes might impact young African Americans who are seeking to get into the media, whichever medium they might be interested in. We'll go in reverse order. Don?
How the business has changed. Well, there aren't the doors that need to be broken down yet. There are a certain number of black and other minority employees in leadership positions, but really very few. Certainly not at the Tribune, and most of the other big papers in the country, with a very few exceptions. You don't find a whole lot of black faces in executive offices. Let me just give you an example. I came to the Tribune in 1990 to be the editorial page editor, to be a boss, and did that job until 2000. And during that time, part of being a boss is of an editorial board is you decide when we have consensus, and you can be like the old Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn. Let me see how many ayes there are, and you may hear two voices, and how many nays? 100. The ayes have it, because he wants it. And that's the good part about being a boss. One of the things I was able to do as the boss was to have Salim Muwakkil write for the op-ed page every week. Very popular column in our paper. Since I'm no longer the boss, a new regime change comes along, and the new guy says, well, I want to try somebody new. I get a certain pleasure every time I get a letter from a reader saying, why don't you guys have Salim Muwakkil anymore? Because, but
Because the brother's not in charge.
but there aren't a lot of people in position to do that, and that's really crucial. We have, you go to the NABJ, National Association of Black Journalists meeting every year, and we have lots of young people coming into the business. Lots of them stay for a few years. Lots of them get discouraged because they don't get to do things in the newsrooms that they want to do. Their missionary instinct in particular gets frustrated, and they go off to make money. As soon as we start getting more dark faces in executive offices, I think some of that will change, but it hasn't happened yet.
Salim?